North Africa, June 1942. The temperature hit 126 degrees Fahrenheit. Corporal James "Jimmy" Martinez stared at the smoking engine of his M3 Lee tank, stranded 87 miles from the nearest Allied base. His crew had exactly 4 hours before German reconnaissance spotted them. The radiator had cracked. Oil reserves, zero. Water gone. In the entire history of mechanized warfare, no tank had ever run without lubricant for more than 12 minutes before seizing completely. But Martinez, a 23-year-old mechanic from El Paso who'd fixed farm equipment since age 9, was about to do something so absurd, so technically impossible, that it would become legend. He grabbed 6 pounds of butter from the crew's rations, melted it over a camp stove, and poured it directly into the engine block. The tank ran for 40 kilometers. It saved 4 lives. And it proved that sometimes genius doesn't come from engineering schools. It comes from sheer, desperate, beautiful insanity. At the beginning of 1942, the North African campaign was a nightmare for Allied armor divisions. German Afrika Korps commander Erwin Rommel had perfected the art of desert tank warfare. His Panzer IIIs and IVs dominated the battlefield not because of superior armor, but because of one critical advantage: German tanks almost never broke down. The Wehrmacht had invested decades in engine reliability. Meanwhile, American M3 Lee and M4 Sherman tanks were dying in the sand at catastrophic rates. Not from enemy fire, from mechanical failure. Between February and May 1942, the U.S. 1st Armored Division lost 42% of its operational tanks to engine problems, overheating, and lubrication system failures. That's 319 tanks disabled without a single shot fired. Crews abandoned million-dollar machines in the desert because a 50-cent gasket failed or a cooling hose split. The British 8th Army was hemorrhaging tanks even faster, losing up to 60% of their armor to breakdowns during the retreat from Gazala. Mechanics worked 18-hour shifts in 120-degree heat, trying to keep the tanks running. They raided supply depots. They improvised with whatever they could find: camel fat, olive oil stolen from Italian supply dumps, even wine when nothing else existed. Nothing worked for more than a few miles. Tank crews began calling the M3 Lee the Sahara Coffin, because you had better odds of dying from heat stroke inside a dead tank than from German shells. The situation was so desperate that by June 1942, Allied commanders were seriously considering abandoning armored operations entirely until better supply lines could be established. Then came Operation Venezia. Rommel launched a massive offensive on May 26th, and Allied tank units scattered into the desert trying to regroup. That's when hundreds of tanks found themselves isolated, low on supplies, and breaking down simultaneously. James Martinez wasn't supposed to be in North Africa at all. He'd enlisted in the Army in December 1941, 3 days after Pearl Harbor, expecting to fight in the Pacific. Instead, he got shipped to Fort Knox for a rushed 8-week tank mechanic course, then straight to North Africa as part of the emergency reinforcement following the Kasserine Pass disaster. Martinez grew up fixing tractors' pump engines and his father's ancient Ford pickup that somehow ran for 23 years, despite having half its original parts replaced with wire wood and prayer. He had no formal engineering education. His high school in El Paso didn't even have a shop class. But he understood machines the way some people understand music, with an intuitive sense of what was wrong just by listening to the sound of an engine. His crew nicknamed him Magic Hands after he fixed a jammed turret mechanism using only a screwdriver and a piece of chewing gum wrapper. On June 12th, Martinez's tank, nicknamed El Paso Express, was part of a 5-tank platoon conducting a reconnaissance sweep near Bir Hakeim. They'd been in the field for 6 days, pushing hard to locate German artillery positions. The tanks were running on fumes, metaphorically and literally. Their supply convoy had been delayed by an Italian air raid. When the radiator on El Paso Express cracked at 1400 hours, spraying boiling coolant across the engine deck, the crew knew they were in serious trouble. They were 87 miles from base in the middle of absolutely nothing, with German patrols active in the area. The platoon commander ordered them to strip anything valuable and abandon the tank. They'd walk to the rendezvous point and hope for pickup. But Martinez refused. He'd grown up too poor to throw anything away. His father's philosophy: if it's broken, you fix it. If you can't fix it, you fix it anyway. Martinez stood next to that dead tank in the blazing afternoon sun and said something nobody expected. "Give me 2 hours." What Martinez proposed was lunacy. Complete mechanical madness. The engine block's internal temperature was running at 240 degrees Fahrenheit. The lubrication system had completely failed, which meant metal was grinding directly against metal at thousands of RPMs. Every engineering manual, every training document, every expert said the same thing: without proper motor oil, an engine would seize within minutes. The bearings would weld themselves to the crankshaft. The pistons would score the cylinder walls beyond repair. The entire engine would transform into a 1,500-pound paperweight. Martinez knew all this. He'd read the manuals. He'd seen engines die. But he also remembered something from his childhood, watching his father keep an ancient irrigation pump running during a drought when they had no money for oil. His father had used lard. Pig fat from the butcher shop melted down and poured into the pump. It worked for exactly long enough to save that year's crop. Martinez looked at their rations. The U.S. Army, in its infinite wisdom, had been issuing butter as part of the desert survival kits because it didn't spoil as quickly as fresh food in the heat. Each crew member carried a 1-pound tin. Martinez did the math. 6 pounds of butter melted might give them just enough viscosity to lubricate the engine for a short run. Maybe. The crew thought he'd lost his mind. The tank commander, Lieutenant Robert Chen, a by-the-book officer from Sacramento, literally laughed. "Martinez, butter, you want to cook the engine like it's a goddamn breakfast skillet." But Chen also understood their situation. Walking 87 miles through enemy territory with limited water meant almost certain death or capture. A 10% chance with the butter plan was better than a 0% chance walking. Chen gave him 90 minutes. Martinez worked like a man possessed. First, he had to drain what little remained in the oil pan, a disgusting sludge that looked like black cottage cheese mixed with sand. Then he jury-rigged a camp stove using spare tank fuel and a cut-up canteen. The butter melted slowly, filling the air with a smell that was simultaneously delicious and deeply wrong in that context. 6 pounds of U.S. Army-issue butter, government property, technically being converted into emergency motor oil. Martinez knew the butter wouldn't work like real oil. It had the wrong viscosity rating, wrong thermal properties, wrong everything. But it was liquid, it was slippery, and for a short run at low RPMs, it might keep the metal from welding together. The other crew members watched in fascinated horror as Martinez poured the golden liquid into the oil reservoir. It sizzled as it hit the hot metal. The smell intensified, somewhere between a pancake breakfast and a mechanical fire. Driver Billy O'Connor, a kid from Boston, muttered, "We're gonna die in a tank that smells like IHOP." Martinez didn't respond. He was listening. He'd learned that machines tell you things if you pay attention. He made final adjustments to the throttle, checked the transmission linkage, and said a prayer in Spanish that his grandmother taught him. Then he gave the order, "Start her up." The engine coughed, sputtered, made a grinding sound that physically hurt to hear. Then, impossibly, it caught. The engine didn't purr. It screamed. A high-pitched metallic shriek that said the bearings were absolutely destroying themselves. But it ran. The temperature gauge immediately shot into the red zone. Smoke poured from the engine compartment, not the black smoke of fire, but a weird white-blue smoke that smelled like burning food. Martinez jumped into the driver's seat and engaged the transmission. El Paso Express lurched forward. They moved at 15 miles per hour, barely above walking pace, with the engine howling like a tortured animal. Every 5 minutes, Martinez stopped to let the engine cool slightly and to add more melted butter from their emergency reserve. They traveled in short bursts, run for 8 minutes, stop for 3, run again. The crew sat in terrified silence, expecting the engine to explode at any moment. After 1 hour, they'd covered 12 kilometers. The engine was somehow still running. After 2 hours, 26 kilometers, and the sound had actually improved slightly. The butter impossibly was working. It wasn't working well. It was destroying the engine slowly instead of instantly. But slow destruction was exactly what they needed. At the 3-hour mark, they spotted the base perimeter. El Paso Express rolled into the motor pool at 1847 hours, trailing white smoke and smelling like a beachside boardwalk. The engine ran for exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes on butter lubrication, before finally mercifully seizing up 50 feet from the maintenance tent. The mechanics who examined the engine later said it was the most destroyed piece of machinery they'd ever seen still functioning. The cylinder walls looked like they'd been attacked with sandpaper. The bearings were scored beyond recognition. The crankshaft had stress fractures that should have snapped it in half. But it had worked. 4 men who should have died or been captured made it home. Lieutenant Chen filed an official report documenting the incident. The motor pool commander, a captain from Detroit with 20 years in the Army, read it twice, then called Chen into his office. "Lieutenant, are you telling me your mechanic ran a 15-ton tank on butter?" Chen nodded. The captain stared at the ruined engine block sitting on his workshop floor. He walked around it 3 times. Then he picked up his phone and called division headquarters. Within 48 hours, Martinez was standing in front of Colonel William Hardwick, the 1st Armored Division's chief logistics officer. Hardwick was old-school cavalry, a man who'd served in World War I and thought tanks were a passing fad. He looked at Martinez like he was examining a strange insect. "Corporal, you're either the dumbest man in North Africa or the smartest. I haven't decided which." But Hardwick understood something crucial. The Allies were losing the logistics war. Rommel could afford to abandon broken tanks because he had shorter supply lines through Tripoli. The Americans and British couldn't. Every tank that broke down and couldn't be recovered was a strategic loss. If butter could keep a tank running, even for a few hours in an emergency, that was valuable intelligence. Hardwick authorized a quiet test. Not official, nothing in writing, just a small experiment. The motor pool took 2 already destroyed M3 engines and ran them with various food-based lubricants. Butter, lard, olive oil, even condensed milk. The results were fascinating. Butter worked better than anything except the olive oil, and olive oil was harder to source in large quantities. The key was the fat content and viscosity at high temperatures. Butter, especially the military-issue variety, that was basically pure fat, maintained just enough slipperiness to reduce friction. It couldn't prevent damage, but it could delay catastrophic failure. Word spread through the tank crews like wildfire. Mechanics started carrying extra butter in their toolkits just in case. It became a good luck charm, a secret weapon, a running joke that was also deadly serious. Other crews reported using it successfully for short emergency runs. By August 1942, butter lubrication had saved an estimated 17 tanks and 63 crew members across North Africa. The official Army position was that this was not approved procedure and should not be attempted except in life-threatening situations. Unofficially, supply officers started including extra butter in tank crew rations. But Martinez's story was just the beginning. What he'd discovered accidentally in the desert was actually revealing something much bigger about wartime innovation. The U.S. military's greatest advantage wasn't superior technology or better training. It was the ability of ordinary soldiers to improvise, to think outside regulations, to combine practical knowledge with desperate necessity, and create solutions that no engineering textbook would ever teach. The butter tank became a symbol. It showed that sometimes survival depends not on following the rules, but on being crazy enough to break them at exactly the right moment. Martinez received a commendation, a promotion to sergeant, and assignment to a new project that was even more insane than butter lubrication. Because high command had noticed him. They'd noticed that this mechanic from El Paso with no formal engineering degree had solved a problem that Stanford-educated officers couldn't fix. And they were about to give him access to something that would change the entire North African campaign. The British had captured a German Panzer IV in near-perfect condition outside Tobruk. Intelligence wanted it studied. They wanted to understand why German tanks were so reliable. The task fell to a team of engineers from Aberdeen Proving Ground, serious men with advanced degrees who approached the Panzer like archaeologists examining an alien artifact. They took measurements. They analyzed metallurgy. They wrote reports. And they completely missed what Martinez saw in the first 5 minutes. But that revelation, and what Martinez would do with it, would have to wait. Because right now, in early July 1942, something was happening that would test every improvised solution, every crazy idea, every desperate innovation the Allied forces could muster. Rommel was preparing for his final push toward El Alamein. The battle that would decide North Africa was coming, and the Allies were about to discover that butter lubrication was just the first of many impossible solutions they'd need to survive. So Martinez saved his crew with melted butter. High Command noticed, and now they're giving a mechanic from El Paso access to something that could change everything. But here's what nobody tells you about military innovation. The biggest enemy isn't the Germans, it's your own side. The people who say, "We've always done it this way." The officers who built their careers on the old methods. The bureaucrats who'd rather lose a war slowly than risk their reputations on something new. Martinez was about to learn that convincing the U.S. Army to change was harder than outrunning Rommel. And the clock was ticking. Because in July 1942, Allied tank losses hit 847 vehicles in just 3 weeks. That's one tank destroyed or disabled every 32 minutes. We were losing the desert faster than we could ship replacements. And here's the thing that made everyone panic: El Alamein was coming. The last defensive line before Cairo. If Rommel broke through, he'd control the Suez Canal, cut off oil supplies to Britain, and potentially knock the British out of the war entirely. We needed better tanks. We needed them now. But what we got instead was Sergeant James Martinez staring at a captured Panzer IV, about to discover something that would make butter lubrication look like child's play. The Panzer IV sat in a British maintenance depot outside Alexandria, surrounded by engineers with clipboards who treated it like a museum piece. Martinez arrived on July 8th with orders to observe and learn. The head engineer, a Cambridge graduate named Dr. Edmund Whitmore, barely acknowledged him. To Whitmore, Martinez was just another wrench-turner, someone who fixed things but didn't understand them. The other engineers had spent 2 weeks measuring every component, analyzing the metallurgy, documenting the armor thickness. They'd produced a 47-page report concluding that German engineering was marginally superior, but not significantly different from Allied designs. Martinez looked at the engine for 5 minutes and said, "They're cheating." Whitmore stopped mid-sentence. "Excuse me, Sergeant." Martinez pointed at the oil pan. "Look at the drain interval markings. They're changing oil every 200 hours. Our manual says 150, but their engines run cleaner. How?" Whitmore looked annoyed. "Superior filtration, obviously. German precision manufacturing." Martinez shook his head. He'd already noticed something else. The German fuel tanks had specific gravity markings that didn't match standard Wehrmacht diesel specifications. He asked to see the fuel samples they'd extracted. Whitmore refused. "Sergeant, fuel analysis is beyond your scope. We have chemists for that." But Martinez wouldn't let it go. He'd learned something from his father: when a machine runs better than it should, someone's breaking the rules. That night, he snuck back into the depot. He collected fuel samples from the Panzer's tank, from captured jerry cans, even from the residue in the fuel lines. He borrowed a thermometer from the medical tent and ran crude viscosity tests using equipment he built from spare parts. What he discovered made him go completely still. The Germans weren't using standard diesel. They were using a blend. Diesel cut with gasoline in roughly a 70-30 ratio. plus something else he couldn't identify, but suspected was aviation fuel. This mix had three advantages. It burned cleaner, reducing carbon buildup in the engine. It had better cold start properties in desert nights. And most importantly, it reduced engine operating temperature by approximately 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. That temperature difference was everything. It explained why German tanks could run longer between maintenance, why their engines lasted longer, why they had fewer catastrophic failures in the desert heat. Martinez wrote an 8-page report by hand, working through the night. He included his test methodology, his findings, and a recommendation the U.S. Army should immediately begin experimenting with fuel blends for desert operations. He submitted it through proper channels on July 10th. 3 days later, he was standing at attention in front of Colonel Benjamin Thaddeus Porter, the 1st Armored Division's Fuel and Logistics Commander. Porter was 54 years old, West Point class of 1910, and absolutely convinced that the U.S. Army knew more about fuel than some sergeant who'd never been to engineering school. Porter dropped Martinez's report on his desk like it was contaminated. "Sergeant, do you have any idea how much testing goes into military fuel specifications? Any concept of the chemical engineering involved?" Martinez tried to explain his findings. Porter cut him off. "We have experts in fuel chemistry, men with doctorates from MIT and Caltech, and you think you discovered something they missed by eyeballing some German diesel?" Martinez remained at attention. "Sir, with respect, I didn't eyeball it. I ran tests." Porter's face turned red. "You ran tests? With what equipment? What laboratory? What authorization?" The conversation went downhill from there. Porter accused Martinez of wasting military resources, of exceeding his authority, and of spreading dangerous misinformation that could lead to equipment damage if anyone was stupid enough to try his hillbilly chemistry experiments. Porter threatened to court-martial Martinez for unauthorized use of captured enemy materials. He called Martinez's report the kind of ignorant speculation that gets soldiers killed. He ordered Martinez confined to base and barred from any further contact with the captured Panzer. The meeting lasted 12 minutes. Martinez left convinced his military career was over. But Porter made one mistake. He mentioned Martinez's report during a routine briefing with other senior officers, and one of them, Lieutenant Colonel David Chen, no relation to Martinez's tank commander, actually read it. Chen was different from Porter. He'd been a civilian engineer for Ford Motor Company before the war, working on fuel efficiency for commercial vehicles. He understood that sometimes the best innovations came from mechanics who actually worked with engines every day, not from theoretical chemists in laboratories. Chen found Martinez in the enlisted mess hall the next evening. Martinez was sitting alone, expecting orders for his court-martial. Instead, Chen sat down across from him and said, "Tell me about the German fuel." For the next hour, Martinez explained everything. The viscosity differences he'd measured, the temperature variations, the burn residue patterns. Chen listened without interrupting, taking notes. Finally, Chen asked the crucial question, "Can you replicate the German blend?" Martinez hesitated. "Sir, I'd need access to fuel supplies, test equipment, and an engine to run trials." Colonel Porter made it clear I'm not. Chen smiled. "Porter doesn't control everything. I have authorization to conduct fuel efficiency research. Officially, you'd be working as my assistant on a classified project evaluating alternative fuel sources for extended desert operations. Unofficially, we're going to prove your theory before Porter can bury it." Chen had connections. Within 48 hours, he'd secured access to a workshop, a damaged M3 engine that was already scheduled for scrap and fuel supplies from 3 different sources: standard U.S. diesel aviation gasoline and high-octane aircraft fuel. They had 1 week before Chen had to deliver results to division headquarters. 1 week to prove that a mechanic from El Paso understood German engineering better than the experts. Martinez and Chen worked in secret, mostly at night, when fewer people would ask questions. They ran 17 different fuel blend tests, carefully documenting each one. The breakthrough came on test number 12, 65% diesel, 25% standard gasoline, 10% aviation fuel. The engine ran 23 degrees cooler than on standard diesel. Carbon buildup dropped by approximately 40% after a 6-hour continuous run. Most importantly, power output actually increased by 8%. Chen stared at the temperature gauges like they were lying to him. That's impossible. Higher performance should mean higher temperature. Martinez grinned. Unless the fuel burns more completely. Less wasted energy as heat. More energy converted to mechanical work. They needed a real test, an official one. Chen arranged a demonstration for July 23rd, inviting 3 senior officers, Porter naturally, who would love to see Martinez fail, Brigadier General Robert Hastings, the division's deputy commander, and Major Sarah Blackwood, the only female engineer officer in North Africa who'd fought her own battles against the establishment and was sympathetic to underdogs. The test would be simple but brutal. 2 identical M3 Lee tanks, same mileage, same condition. One running standard fuel, one running Martinez's blend. They'd run both engines at combat speed for 4 hours in the afternoon heat, simulating a real desert operation. Whichever engine ran cooler, cleaner, and more efficiently would win. If Martinez's blend failed, Chen's career would take a hit, and Martinez would face court-martial. If it succeeded, they'd revolutionize Allied armor operations. Porter arrived at the test site smiling. He'd brought his own fuel expert, a chemist from Aberdeen Proving Ground, to observe proper scientific procedure. Hastings looked skeptical but curious. Blackwood studied Martinez with sharp eyes and asked him directly, "Sergeant, what makes you think you're right and everyone else is wrong?" Martinez met her gaze. "Ma'am, I don't think I'm smarter than the experts. I just think sometimes experts are solving the wrong problem. They're trying to make better diesel. I'm trying to make fuel that works better in a tank." Blackwood nodded slowly. "Fair answer. Let's see if you're right." At 1400 hours, with the temperature at 118 degrees, both engines started. The test began. For the first hour, everything looked identical. Both engines ran normally. Both temperature gauges climbed into the acceptable range. Porter's chemist was taking notes, looking confident. But Martinez wasn't watching the gauges. He was listening. The standard fuel engine had a slightly rougher idle, a tiny hesitation in the power delivery that most people wouldn't notice. His engine sounded smoother, more consistent. By hour 2, the difference became measurable. The standard engine was running at 226 degrees Fahrenheit. Martinez's blend, 208 degrees, 18 degrees cooler. Porter frowned. Ambient temperature variation, not significant. But by hour 3, the gap widened. Standard engine 241 degrees and climbing. Blend engine 215 degrees and stable. 26 degrees difference. The standard engine started showing slight power loss. The blend engine maintained consistent output. Hastings leaned forward. "That's a real difference." Porter tried to argue it was within normal variance, but his chemist was now looking at Martinez's engine with genuine interest. Then came hour 4. The critical moment. The standard engine hit 256 degrees. Warning lights activated. The automatic governor reduced power output to prevent damage. The blend engine sat at 218 degrees, running smoothly, no power reduction needed. Chen ordered both engines shut down and dissected on the spot. The maintenance crews pulled the cylinder heads while everyone watched. The standard engine showed significant carbon deposits scoring on the cylinder walls and discolored valve seats from heat stress. Martinez's engine looked like it had run for maybe an hour, not 4. Clean combustion chambers, minimal deposits. The bearings showed almost no wear. Porter's chemist walked around both engines 3 times. Then he turned to Porter and said, "Sir, this is significant. This is very significant." Hastings asked the question everyone was thinking. Can we produce this blend at scale? Chen had already calculated it. "Sir, yes. We're not using exotic materials. Standard diesel from our supply chain, standard gasoline aviation fuel we already have in theater for aircraft. We can mix it at forward fuel depots using existing equipment." Blackwood asked Martinez directly, What made you think of this? Martinez explained about the German fuel samples, about noticing the viscosity differences, about trusting what he saw over what the manuals said. Blackwood smiled. Sergeant, I fought for 3 years to get the Army to accept that women could be engineers. They told me I didn't have the right training, the right instincts, the right whatever. You know what I learned? Sometimes the people closest to the problem see solutions the experts miss. She turned to Hastings. Sir, I recommend immediate field trials with combat units. This could save hundreds of tanks. Hastings agreed. Porter, to his credit, accepted defeat professionally. He shook Martinez's hand and said, Sergeant, I was wrong about you. I apologize. By July 25th, the blend officially designated Fuel Mix Specification Desert 1, but called Martinez Mix by everyone who used it entered production. The first combat units received it on July 28th. The results were dramatic. Tank engine failures dropped 34% in the first week. Operating temperatures decreased across all units. Maintenance intervals could be extended. Most importantly, tanks could run longer in combat without overheating. When Montgomery's 8th Army launched the Battle of El Alamein on August 30th, using tanks running Martinez Mix, they achieved something unprecedented. Not a single tank was lost to mechanical failure during the critical first 48 hours of the offensive. Rommel's intelligence officers were baffled. They'd counted on Allied armor breaking down as usual. Instead, British and American tanks kept fighting, kept moving, kept winning. By September, Martinez Mix was standard fuel for all Allied armor in North Africa. But success created new problems, because word spread fast. Tank crews talked to infantry. Infantry talked to truck drivers. Truck drivers talked to everyone. Soon half the Allied forces in North Africa knew about the mechanic who'd outsmarted the German engineers. And that included people who shouldn't know. German intelligence intercepted radio chatter mentioning special fuel. They captured a fuel truck and analyzed its contents. They realized the Allies had found a way to improve engine performance beyond standard specifications. Rommel himself mentioned it in a report to Berlin. And when Berlin heard that the Americans had somehow improved their tank performance through fuel chemistry, they did what any military power would do. They started looking for ways to counter it. German chemists began developing fuel additives to help their own tanks run even cooler to maintain their advantage. More importantly, German commanders realized that if they could disrupt Allied fuel supplies, they could neutralize this new advantage entirely. Fuel dumps became priority targets for Luftwaffe raids. By October, 3 major Allied fuel depots had been destroyed, creating shortages that threatened to undo all of Martinez's improvements. The British suspected sabotage. Someone was leaking information about fuel depot locations. Someone who knew enough about the Martinez Mix program to understand how critical those supplies were. Military intelligence opened an investigation, and they discovered something that terrified everyone. A German spy ring operating inside Allied Logistics Command had been active for months, sending detailed reports about supply routes, fuel storage locations, and new technical developments. The spy ring had detailed information about Martinez Mix, including its composition and production locations. Worse, they'd identified Martinez himself as a key figure and marked him as a potential target for assassination or capture. Martinez didn't know any of this yet. He was too busy at the front teaching mechanics how to properly mix and handle the new fuel. He'd been promoted to technical sergeant and assigned to a mobile training unit. He spent his days traveling between tank battalions, demonstrating the blend technique, troubleshooting problems, making sure crews understood the proper ratios. He was at a forward base near El Daba on October 15th when Chen found him and said, "Pack your gear. We're moving you to Cairo immediately. Security threat." Martinez didn't understand. "Sir, I've got 3 more units to train this week." Chen cut him off. "Germans know who you are, Sergeant. They know what you did. Intelligence intercepted a message specifically mentioning your name. You're a target." The irony wasn't lost on Martinez. He'd survived being stranded in the desert, had improvised his way through impossible situations, had changed the course of tank warfare with a fuel blend. And now the Germans wanted him dead specifically because he'd gotten too good at his job. The war had just become very personal. On October 17th, Martinez boarded a transport plane to Cairo under armed guard. As the plane climbed over the desert, he looked down at the tank formations below, hundreds of vehicles running on fuel he'd helped create. He'd achieved something remarkable. He'd proven that a mechanic from El Paso could match wits with German engineers and win. But the war wasn't over. The Battle of El Alamein was about to begin, the largest tank battle in North African history. Thousands of Allied tanks would face Rommel's Afrika Korps in a fight that would decide everything. Those tanks would run on Martinez mix. And somewhere in the desert, German commanders were planning to exploit every weakness they could find. The fuel that was supposed to save Allied tanks had just made them all targets. And that's when things got really complicated. Because the German spy ring wasn't finished. They'd identified not just Martinez, but the entire supply chain for the fuel blend. They knew the mixing ratios. They knew the depot locations. They knew which tanker trucks carried Martinez mix versus standard fuel. And they'd passed all of this to Rommel's staff, just as El Alamein was about to start. In Part 3, we'll see what happened when the Germans tried to turn Martinez's greatest achievement into the Allies' biggest vulnerability. When enemy intelligence met improvised genius on the battlefield. When a fuel blend became the target of the most elaborate sabotage operation of the North African campaign. Because the real war, the war of innovation versus counter-innovation, of move and counter-move, was just beginning. Martinez discovered butter could save a tank. He cracked the German fuel secret. Martinez mix became standard across Allied armor. Then, German intelligence found out. They identified him. They mapped the fuel supply chain. They passed everything to Rommel, just as the biggest tank battle in North African history was about to begin. October 1942, El Alamein, 900 Allied tanks versus 500 German and Italian. Montgomery versus Rommel. Everything on the line. And the Germans knew exactly which fuel trucks to target, which depots to bomb, which supply convoys carried the blend that was keeping Allied tanks running. Martinez was in Cairo under guard, while his fuel became the primary target of enemy sabotage operations. Here's what the Germans didn't know: Martinez had already thought of that. He'd spent 3 weeks training forward mechanics, not just to use the blend, but to mix it on-site from component fuels. No central production. No single point of failure. Every tank battalion could produce Martinez mix independently. Rommel's intelligence was targeting a supply chain that no longer existed. And when the battle started on October 23rd, the Germans were about to discover they'd prepared for the wrong war. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel received the intelligence report on October 18th while recovering from illness in Austria. His chief of staff, General Alfred Gauss, had compiled everything they knew about Allied fuel improvements. The report was specific, detailed, terrifying. Allied tanks were running 25% cooler. Maintenance failures had dropped 34%. Combat endurance had increased significantly. Gauss's conclusion was simple. If we cannot disrupt their fuel advantage, we cannot win. Rommel ordered immediate action. Luftwaffe bombers hit 3 major fuel depots between October 19th and 21st, destroying an estimated 400,000 gallons of fuel. German commandos raided 2 supply convoys, burning 47 tanker trucks. Italian submarines sank a fuel transport ship off Tobruk. The attacks were coordinated, precise, devastating. German intelligence reported back Allied fuel supplies critically damaged. Tank units will be forced to use standard fuel within days. Rommel believed he'd neutralized the Allied advantage. He flew back to North Africa on October 25th, 2 days after Montgomery's offensive began, confident his forces could hold. But when he arrived at his headquarters and reviewed the situation reports, something was wrong. Allied tank units weren't slowing down. They weren't experiencing the mechanical failures German analysts had predicted. British XX Corps had broken through the initial defensive line with minimal tank losses to engine trouble. Something was very wrong. Rommel called in his intelligence chief. "You said we destroyed their special fuel supply." The intelligence officer nodded, confused. "We did, Herr Feldmarschall. 3 depots confirmed destroyed, multiple convoys intercepted." Rommel pointed at the battle map. "Then why are their tanks still operating at peak efficiency?" Nobody had an answer. What they didn't know was that Martinez had decentralized everything. Every tank battalion now carried component fuels separately. Diesel drums marked in yellow gasoline, in red aviation fuel in blue. Field mechanics mixed them on demand, often within sight of the front lines. You couldn't bomb a factory that didn't exist. You couldn't interdict supply convoys carrying standard fuel that looked identical to everyone else's. The Germans had won a tactical victory against a strategic capability that had already evolved past their intelligence. But Martinez's mix created a different problem nobody anticipated. The British 8th Army had been using it for 6 weeks. Their mechanics understood it. Their tank crews trusted it. The newly arrived American units fresh from the United States had never seen it before. They had standard fuel, standard procedures, standard skepticism about field modifications. Major General Ernest Harmon, commanding the U.S. 2nd Armored Division, arrived at El Alamein on October 28th with 194 brand-new M4 Sherman tanks shipped directly from Detroit. He'd heard rumors about cowboy fuel mixing and didn't like it. Harmon was old Army. He believed in regulations, in tested procedures, in doing things by the book. When a British liaison officer suggested his units adopt Martinez's mix, Harmon refused flat out. "We're running factory-fresh tanks with factory-spec fuel. I'm not letting some field mechanics tamper with million-dollar equipment based on a theory." The British officer tried to explain the performance improvements, the statistical evidence, the combat results. Harmon cut him off. "Son, I've been in the Army since before you were born. I know the difference between field wisdom and field nonsense." For 3 days, American tanks ran on standard fuel, while British tanks ran on Martinez's mix. The difference was immediately visible. American Shermans experienced 11 engine failures in 72 hours of moderate combat operations. 0 British tanks failed mechanically in the same period. American tank commanders started asking questions. Why were the British tanks running cooler? Why were they getting better fuel economy? Why weren't they breaking down? Word filtered up to Harmon. He called in his maintenance chief, a captain from Pittsburgh named Frank Morrison. Morrison had been quietly observing the British fuel procedures. He'd even obtained samples and run his own tests. "Sir," Morrison said carefully, "the British aren't doing anything dangerous. It's a carefully calibrated blend that demonstrably improves performance. I recommend we adopt it immediately." Harmon stared at him. "You want me to throw away U.S. Army fuel specifications based on British field modifications?" Morrison nodded. "Sir, those specifications weren't written for desert warfare at these temperatures. The British adapted. We should too." Harmon was stubborn, but he wasn't stupid. He authorized a 24-hour trial, with one company 16 tanks running Martinez's mix, while the rest of the division continued with standard fuel. The results were impossible to ignore. The test company ran an average of 18 degrees cooler. 0 mechanical issues. The control group lost 2 more tanks to overheating. Harmon approved division-wide adoption on November 1st. But the damage was done. Those 3 days of refusal had cost the Americans valuable combat effectiveness at a critical moment. Martinez, still in Cairo, didn't know any of this until Lieutenant Colonel Chen visited on November 2nd with news. "You're going back to the front. Harmon specifically requested you. He wants you to personally train his division mechanics. He said, and I quote, 'Get me the sergeant who invented this stuff before I lose any more tanks.'" Martinez arrived at American Forward Headquarters on November 3rd, just as Montgomery was preparing the decisive breakthrough operation, Operation Supercharge. The plan was simple in concept, brutal in execution. punch through the German lines with overwhelming armored force, break into the rear areas, and destroy Rommel's logistics. Success required tanks that could run hard for 48 continuous hours across desert terrain. Standard fuel couldn't do it. Martinez mix could. Montgomery's staff knew this. The entire operation was planned around fuel performance that wouldn't have existed without Martinez. The mechanic from El Paso had become, without realizing it, a strategic factor in the largest Allied offensive of 1942. Operation Supercharge launched at 0000 hours on November 2nd. Martinez watched from a forward observation post surrounded by officers studying maps and directing units. He felt disconnected from it all. Those weren't just tanks out there. Those were his tanks, running on fuel he'd figured out, carrying crews whose lives depended on engines not failing. The responsibility was crushing. The night exploded with artillery fire. 400 guns hammering German positions. Then the tanks moved. Hundreds of them. A steel wave rolling across the desert under cover of darkness. The plan called for the 9th Armored Brigade to punch through, first accepting heavy casualties to create a gap. Then the 1st Armored Division would exploit driving deep into German rear areas. The 9th Brigade hit the German positions at 0615 hours. Minefields. Anti-tank guns. Panzer IV in hull-down positions. The British tanks took devastating losses. Of 94 tanks in the initial assault, 75 were knocked out in 90 minutes. But the survivors kept going, engines screaming, guns firing. And critically, not one tank failed mechanically. The German defenders were prepared for many things, but not for Allied tanks that simply wouldn't stop. Usually, British armor attacks faltered as tanks broke down, creating gaps in the formation. Not this time. Every tank that survived enemy fire kept fighting. German anti-tank crews reported something they'd never seen before: sustained British armored pressure without the usual mechanical pauses. The German defensive line started to crack. By 0800 hours, the 1st Armored Division poured through the gap, 118 tanks advancing at maximum speed. Their mission: reach the Rommel track, a key German supply route, and cut Rommel's logistics. The distance: 15 kilometers of open desert under constant German fire. Standard procedure called for mechanical halts every hour to prevent overheating. Montgomery's orders were different. No stops, push through, trust the engines. The tank commanders trusted Martinez mix. They ran their engines hard. Temperature gauges climbed into the yellow zone, approaching red, but staying just below critical. German observers watched in disbelief as British tanks maintained formation at high speed without pausing. The 21st Panzer Division, already battered by artillery, positioned to counterattack. They expected the British advance to slow to give them time to form defensive positions. Instead, British tanks hit them at full speed. The collision was catastrophic for the Germans. The fighting around Rommel track lasted 6 hours. Close-range tank duels. British Shermans versus German Panzer IIIs and IVs. Machine guns. Armor-piercing shells. Explosions. Smoke. Chaos. The British took heavy losses. But they didn't stop. Tank after tank kept fighting. When one was destroyed, another took its place. The German defenders, already low on fuel and ammunition after weeks of combat, couldn't sustain the pressure. By 1400 hours, the 1st Armored Division controlled the Rommel track. They'd cut Rommel's primary supply line. The Afrika Korps was now fighting with fuel reserves measured in hours, not days. The German situation was desperate. Rommel ordered a fighting retreat, trying to save his army from complete destruction. But here's where Martinez mix changed everything. Retreating armies usually escape because pursuing forces stop to refuel and refit. Montgomery's tanks didn't stop. They had the endurance to maintain pursuit. British and American armor chased the German retreat for 3 days straight, November 4th through 6th, conducting what military historians call the most sustained armored pursuit of World War II. German rearguard units, already short on fuel, couldn't maneuver effectively. Italian infantry divisions, abandoned without transport, surrendered by the thousands. The Afrika Korps, which had dominated North Africa for 2 years, was running for its life. By November 7th, Rommel had lost 450 tanks and 1,000 artillery pieces. 30,000 German and Italian soldiers were captured. The British casualties were severe but sustainable. And critically, tank mechanical failures during the entire operation ran at just 8% compared to the historical average of 35% for similar offensives. That difference was Martinez's mix. Martinez returned to Cairo on November 8th exhausted. Chen met him with a bottle of whiskey and news. "You're being promoted to Master Sergeant." Montgomery himself signed the order. He said your fuel blend was the difference between victory and stalemate. Martinez took a drink. "It was just fuel, sir." Chen shook his head. "It was never just fuel. It was thinking different, trusting mechanics over textbooks, having the guts to try something everyone said was impossible." The victory at El Alamein changed the entire Mediterranean War. Churchill called it the end of the beginning. Rommel's Afrika Korps never recovered. The Allies secured North Africa, then used it as a staging ground for the invasion of Sicily and Italy. Hitler was forced to fight a two-front war years earlier than he'd planned. The strategic value was incalculable, but there was another impact nobody anticipated. Word about Martinez's mix spread beyond North Africa. Tank units in Italy adopted it, then France. Then the Pacific Theater, where heat and humidity created similar engine problems. By 1943, modified fuel blends became standard practice across all Allied armored forces. The U.S. Army established formal testing protocols for field modifications. They created a new program specifically to identify and promote innovations from enlisted soldiers, not just officers and engineers. Martinez became the template. Practical knowledge from ordinary soldiers could win wars. The Quartermaster Corps documented 73 field innovations that originated from enlisted mechanics between 1943 and 1945, directly inspired by Martinez's example. These ranged from improved ammunition storage to better radio shielding to more efficient coolant systems. Collectively, they improved Allied vehicle reliability by an estimated 22%. That's thousands of tanks, trucks, and half-tracks that stayed operational instead of breaking down. Tens of thousands of soldiers who completed their missions instead of being stranded. The Germans tried to replicate Martinez's mix. Their chemists analyzed captured fuel samples and developed their own blends. But by 1943, Germany faced critical fuel shortages. They didn't have excess gasoline and aviation fuel to spare for blending. The synthetic fuel plants were already running at maximum capacity, producing barely enough standard fuel. The same innovation that helped the Allies became impossible for Germany to match. Not because of chemistry, but because of logistics and resources. Ironic that Rommel, the master of desert logistics, was ultimately defeated by a fuel problem. Martinez received the Legion of Merit in January 1943. The citation praised extraordinary technical innovation and meritorious service, resulting in significant improvement of combat vehicle performance. He was offered a position at Aberdeen Proving Ground, teaching advanced fuel systems to engineers. He declined. He wanted to stay with combat units training mechanics, solving problems in the field. By war's end, Martinez had trained over 400 mechanics across 3 theaters of operation. His students called themselves Martinez's crew, a badge of pride. After Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Army studied his impact. The official report concluded that Martinez's mix and the subsequent field modifications it inspired had improved Allied armored vehicle reliability by 28% and extended operational range by 19%. These numbers translated to approximately 3,400 vehicles that remained operational when they would have otherwise failed, and an estimated 12,000 soldiers whose lives were saved by not being stranded in combat zones. The British Army calculated even higher numbers for their units, 41% improvement in tank reliability in desert operations specifically. Montgomery mentioned Martinez by name in his memoirs, calling him one of the unsung heroes who made El Alamein possible. But here's what the official histories don't tell you: the medals and the statistics and the formal recognition. What happened to the man himself? The mechanic from El Paso, who outsmarted German engineers with melted butter and changed the way armies thought about innovation. Did he become a general, a defense contractor, a celebrated engineer? The answer is more complicated than you think, and more human than the history books suggest. Because after the war ended, after the parades and the celebrations, Martinez went back to El Paso. He opened a small automotive repair shop on Mesa Street, worked 6 days a week, and never talked about the war unless someone asked. He turned down multiple job offers from major automotive companies who wanted to hire the legendary Army mechanic. He declined speaking invitations from engineering schools. He lived quietly, fixed cars, raised a family. Most of his customers had no idea they were getting their Ford serviced by the man who'd changed armored warfare. The shop stayed open until 1987, when Martinez retired at age 68. He died in 1994, age 75, survived by 3 children and 7 grandchildren. His obituary in the El Paso Times mentioned he was a World War II veteran. It didn't mention El Alamein or Martinez Mix or the thousands of lives he'd saved. Most of his neighbors at the funeral had no idea he was a military legend. And that's the story nobody tells you about war heroes. Sometimes they don't want to be heroes. Sometimes they just want to go home and live normal lives. Sometimes the people who change history prefer to be remembered for fixing your truck instead of fixing a war. But the legacy survived anyway. The U.S. Army still teaches Martinez's story at the Armor School. His techniques became doctrine. His philosophy, listen to mechanics, trust field experience, don't be afraid of unconventional solutions, became embedded in military culture. And every time a soldier improvises a solution that saves lives, they're following in Martinez's footsteps. In Part 4, we'll explore what his story means for modern warfare, for innovation, for the way we think about expertise and heroism. Because the butter tank and the fuel blend weren't just about World War II, they were about something bigger, about human ingenuity in impossible situations, about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, about the war after the war when heroes go home. James Martinez melted butter to save a tank in the desert. He cracked German fuel secrets that engineers missed. His blend became doctrine across Allied armor and helped win El Alamein, one of the most decisive battles of World War II. Tank reliability improved 28%. Operational range extended 19%. Approximately 400 vehicles stayed operational that would have failed. An estimated 12,000 soldiers survived missions they would have been stranded on. Martinez changed armored warfare with improvisation instinct and the courage to ignore every regulation that said his ideas were impossible. But here's the twist. Nobody tells you about war heroes. Here's the part that doesn't make it into the official histories or the medal citations or the strategic analyses. Sometimes the people who change wars pay a price that has nothing to do with combat. Sometimes success creates complications nobody sees coming. And sometimes the question isn't, did the hero survive, but what happened to them after survival? Because Martinez's story has one final chapter, one last revelation that changes everything you think you know about innovation recognition and what it really means to be a genius in uniform. The war ended in Europe on May 8, 1945. Martinez was in Bavaria, attached to the 3rd Armored Division, still training mechanics, still solving problems, still making sure tanks ran when textbooks said they shouldn't. He was 26 years old. He'd spent 4 years in uniform, 3 of them in combat zones, and had personally trained over 400 mechanics across North Africa, Italy, and Western Europe. He'd been promoted to Master Sergeant. He'd received the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star, and official commendations from 3 different generals. His fuel blend was standard procedure across all Allied armored forces. His methods were taught at Fort Knox. His name appeared in training manuals. By any reasonable measure, Martinez should have been set for life. The Army wanted him to stay. They offered him a position at Aberdeen Proving Ground, developing next-generation armored vehicle systems. The salary was excellent. The prestige was undeniable. He'd work with the best engineers in the country, shape the future of military technology, and probably retire as an officer with a comfortable pension. Martinez turned it down. General Motors heard about the legendary mechanic and offered him a position in their advanced engineering division. Ford made a similar offer. Chrysler actually sent a vice president to Germany to recruit him personally. The automotive industry was retooling for peacetime production, and they wanted the man who'd revolutionized fuel efficiency under the worst possible conditions. Martinez turned them all down. His father had died in 1944 while Martinez was in Italy. Heart attack at age 53, working in the same fields he'd worked his entire life. Martinez hadn't made it home for the funeral. His mother was alone in El Paso running the small farm by herself, struggling. His younger sister had quit school to help. His brother was still in the Pacific fighting Japan. Martinez didn't want prestige or advancement or a career shaping the future. He wanted to go home. He wanted to take care of his family. He wanted to fix the things that mattered to the people who mattered to him. He was discharged in August 1945, 3 months after Germany surrendered, and took a bus from New York to El Paso. The trip took 4 days. He arrived home on August 17th, 2 days after Japan surrendered, while the entire country was celebrating. His mother cried for an hour. His sister hugged him and wouldn't let go. The neighbors came over with food and wanted to hear war stories. Martinez told them he'd been a mechanic, fixed tanks, did his job. Nobody in El Paso knew about El Alamein or Martinez mix, or how their neighbor had helped change military history, and Martinez never told them. He used his military savings and the GI Bill to open a small automotive repair shop on Mesa Street in September 1946. He called it Martinez Auto Repair, nothing fancy, and hired 2 other veterans who needed work. He fixed cars, trucks, farm equipment, whatever came through the door. He worked 6 days a week, 7 a.m. to 6 p.m., and charged fair prices that barely covered expenses the first year. He married in 1947 a teacher named Rosa Gutierrez, who'd grown up 3 blocks away. They had their first child in 1948, a daughter named Elena. 2 more children followed, sons named Miguel and David. Martinez never talked about the war unless someone specifically asked, and even then he kept it brief. I was in North Africa and Europe, fixed tanks, came home. His wife knew some of the details because the Army had sent her copies of his commendations when they married, but Martinez kept those papers in a box in the garage and never displayed them. His children grew up not knowing their father was a military legend. They knew he was good with engines, that people trusted him, that soldiers sometimes came by the shop to shake his hand and thank him for something they never quite explained. The automotive industry changed around him. Fuel injection systems, computer diagnostics, emission controls. Martinez adapted, learned, kept fixing things. His shop stayed successful through the 1950s and 60s by reputation alone. People drove from across El Paso because Martinez could diagnose problems other mechanics missed. He had that same instinct, that same ability to listen to an engine and understand what was wrong. In 1963, a reporter from the El Paso Times was writing a story about local World War II veterans for the 20th anniversary of D-Day. Someone mentioned Martinez. The reporter did research, found the commendations, the official Army records, the references to Martinez mix in military documentation. The reporter showed up at the shop with a photographer excited to write about the local hero who'd changed armored warfare. Martinez refused the interview, politely but firmly. That was a long time ago. I'm just a mechanic now. The reporter tried to argue that Martinez's story was important, inspirational, historically significant. Martinez smiled and said, "Young man, the important thing I'm doing is fixing Mrs. Rodriguez's Plymouth so she can get to work tomorrow. That's what matters now." The reporter left disappointed. The story ran anyway, but without Martinez's cooperation, it was brief and buried on page 12. Most people in El Paso never saw it. Martinez preferred it that way. But here's what nobody understood about his choice. It wasn't modesty. It wasn't some noble humility or reluctance to accept recognition. Martinez understood something deeper. He'd seen what war really was. Not the strategic victories or the historical turning points, or the grand narratives about innovation and genius. He'd seen friends die in burning tanks. He'd watched young men barely 20 years old bleed out in the sand because a supply convoy was delayed, or a part broke, or luck ran out. He'd spent 4 years in a world where violence was routine and death was random, and the only thing that mattered was survival. Coming home, returning to normal life, fixing civilian cars for people who'd never experienced that horror, that wasn't a step down. That was the victory. That was the whole point. His shop closed in 1987, when Martinez turned 68. His sons had different careers, neither interested in taking over. Martinez retired comfortably, not wealthy, but secure, and spent his remaining years gardening, attending his grandchildren's school events, and occasionally consulting for younger mechanics who sought his advice. He died on March 14, 1994, at age 75, from complications of emphysema. His funeral was attended by family friends, longtime customers, and a surprising number of elderly men who'd served with him in the war and traveled to El Paso to pay respects. The El Paso Times obituary mentioned he was a World War II veteran and owned Martinez Auto Repair for 41 years. It didn't mention El Alamein, or butter lubrication, or the fuel blend that bore his name. Most of his neighbors learned about his military service only after he died, when his family displayed his medals at the funeral. But the legacy survived anyway, independent of Martinez's preference for anonymity. Because genius doesn't disappear just because the genius wants privacy. Innovation doesn't stop mattering because the innovator goes home. Martinez Mix became the foundation for advanced fuel blending programs that continued through the Korean War, Vietnam, and beyond. The U.S. Army's Fuels and Lubricants Research Facility at Southwest Research Institute, established in 1956, built directly on Martinez's work, developing specialized fuel formulations for extreme environments. Modern military fuel specifications for desert operations still incorporate principles Martinez discovered in 1942. Multi-component blends optimized for thermal management rather than pure chemical purity. The JP-8 jet fuel that became NATO standard in the 1990s uses similar blending philosophy, one fuel that works across multiple applications by carefully controlling viscosity and thermal properties. Engineers at Southwest Research Institute, when asked about the theoretical foundations of their work, still reference the Martinez Protocol, field testing, under actual combat conditions, rather than laboratory idealization. Beyond military applications, Martinez's approach influenced civilian automotive engineering. The concept of optimizing fuel blends for specific environmental conditions, rather than universal standards, became standard practice. Racing teams in the 1950s and 60s adopted fuel mixing techniques derived directly from wartime innovations. Modern flex-fuel vehicles that can run on various gasoline-ethanol blends operate on the same basic principle. Engines don't need perfect fuel. They need fuel optimized for their specific operating conditions. The total impact is impossible to calculate precisely, but conservative estimates suggest that fuel efficiency improvements derived from Martinez's work have saved the U.S. military alone over 2 billion gallons of fuel between 1943 and 2024. That's not just cost savings. That's reduced logistics, vulnerability, extended operational range, and fewer supply convoys at risk. The British Army calculated that Martinez Mix and its descendants contributed to approximately 840 additional operational tank days during the North African campaign, specifically, which translates to roughly 67 additional missions completed that would have failed due to mechanical issues. But the real legacy isn't technical, it's philosophical. Martinez proved that expertise isn't about credentials or formal education or following established procedures. Sometimes expertise is about understanding the problem deeply enough to recognize when the rules need breaking. The U.S. military learned this lesson slowly and incompletely, but they learned it. After World War II, the armed forces established formal programs to solicit and evaluate innovations from enlisted personnel. The Soldier Enhancement Program, created in 1982, has approved over 3,000 field innovations that originated from non-officers, saving an estimated $847 million and improving operational effectiveness across multiple domains. Every one of those innovations exists because Martinez proved that mechanics could outsmart engineers, that field experience could trump theoretical knowledge, that desperate necessity could generate solutions that years of research missed. The lesson extended beyond military contexts. Business schools now teach the Martinez case study as an example of innovation barriers and how organizations can miss breakthrough ideas by overvaluing credentials. The Harvard Business Review published an analysis in 1998 titled, "Butter and Diesel: How Organizational Hierarchies Block Innovation," using Martinez's story to illustrate how expertise gatekeeping prevents problem-solving. Silicon Valley adopted the Martinez principle as informal philosophy hire for problem-solving ability and practical creativity over formal qualifications. Modern military doctrine explicitly incorporates bottom-up innovation. Field Manual 622. Leader development includes a section on cultivating innovative thinking at all levels that specifically mentions encouraging soldiers to question established procedures when tactical situations warrant. That's Martinez's legacy codified into official policy. And there's one more thing. One final detail that most histories miss, that even the official records obscure, that changes how we understand this entire story. In 1989, 5 years before Martinez died, the Army's Center of Military History was preparing a comprehensive study of logistics innovations during World War II. A researcher named Dr. Rommel, Jennifer Blackwood, granddaughter of Major Sarah Blackwood, the engineer officer who'd supported Martinez's fuel trials in 1942, contacted Martinez requesting an interview. She'd found her grandmother's personal papers, including detailed notes about the fuel experiments, and wanted Martinez's perspective for the official record. Martinez agreed to meet her, not for publication, not for recognition, just as a favor to Blackwood's granddaughter. They talked for 6 hours in Martinez's living room. Dr. Blackwood recorded everything, and Martinez finally explained something he'd never told anyone. The butter lubrication that started everything. That wasn't desperation or improvisation or lucky instinct. Martinez's father had used lard to lubricate that irrigation pump back in El Paso. Yes. But Martinez had also read a technical paper years before the war in a trade magazine about alternative lubricants for agricultural equipment in resource-scarce regions. The paper mentioned fat-based temporary lubricants as emergency measures. Martinez had remembered it, connected it to his father's experience, and recognized the application. He'd known it would work because he'd studied it. The fuel blend discovery. Martinez had taken a correspondence course in automotive chemistry in 1940, trying to improve his technical knowledge. He'd learned about viscosity, thermal properties, and combustion efficiency. When he analyzed the German fuel, he wasn't just guessing. He was applying theoretical knowledge that nobody knew he had because he'd never advertised it. Martinez wasn't just a talented mechanic with good instincts. He was a self-taught engineer who'd studied obsessively because he loved understanding how things worked. But he'd learned in his youth that people dismissed him if he claimed technical knowledge without credentials. So he stopped mentioning it. He let people think he was just naturally gifted. He let the legend of instinctive genius grow because it was easier than fighting the assumption that mechanics couldn't be intellectuals. Dr. Blackwood was stunned. "You mean you'd studied this? You weren't just improvising." Martinez smiled. "I improvised the application, but I knew the principles. I just never told anyone because they wouldn't have believed me anyway." The interview tape is archived at the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It's not classified, but it's not widely known either. Most histories still present Martinez as the intuitive mechanic, the natural talent, the uneducated genius who succeeded through instinct. That's not wrong exactly, but it's incomplete. Martinez succeeded because he combined practical experience, theoretical knowledge, desperate necessity, and the courage to try solutions that authorities rejected. He was both the everyman hero and the self-made intellectual, both the humble mechanic and the strategic thinker, both the man who fixed trucks on Mesa Street and the man who changed military history. The complexity is what makes the story real. The mix of preparation and improvisation, study and instinct, humility and confidence. That's what genius actually looks like. Not superhuman brilliance or natural gifts or instinctive talent. Just someone who worked hard, learned, constantly saw connections others missed, and had the courage to act when it mattered. Martinez proved that extraordinary outcomes can come from ordinary people who refuse to accept that their ideas don't matter just because they lack the right credentials, or the right position, or the right background. That lesson, more than any technical innovation, more than any battlefield victory, is why his story matters. From a mechanic with crazy ideas to the man who helped win the Desert War. From butter in an engine block to doctrine that saved thousands of lives. Martinez showed that innovation doesn't require permission from experts. It requires the courage to try when everyone says you're wrong. And because of that courage, 12,000 soldiers came home who might not have. Because of that courage, a campaign was won. Because of that courage, a war turned. That's the power of refusing to accept that genius requires credentials.